Hi everybody, as promised, we are back for part 2 of the suicide assessment training. The first part kind of focused on how to start with an assessment, kind of the posture you take with students, and some warning signs, and then some statistics as well about why we do this training. So part 2 is going to focus kind of on the specific tool called the SAFETY. It's created by SAMHSA. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Treatment Department, part of the Department of Health. And so I'm going to walk you through that. So walk through those sides. All right, so you can see there's 5 steps of assessment. We're going to be looking at identifying risk factors, protective factors, asking about suicide, what the risk level you place the individual at, and then the 5th one is document. So this is, again, tailored towards a clinical setting. So there's not necessarily like this documentation expectation that you have to do, but we'll kind of talk about why it's important to kind of record and keep track of assessments just for future assessments, also for liability reasons. So number 1 is identifying risk factors. So the goal of this step is to identify factors or things that are going on that can be modified to reduce the risk of the individual actually following through on their suicidal ideations or intent. So there's 6 kind of areas that we look at with risk factors. So you're going to kind of want to identify if there's any current suicidal behavior. So actually want to look at the history, See if this is something that's a pattern for the individual. If they've attempted before, have they started and then stopped suicide attempts, or do they have a history of self-injurious behaviors? Again, there's another typo. It's supposed to be self-injurious, not that's not even a word. So if the individual has a history of this or is prone to hurting themselves or having some sort of risky behaviors, it is definitely something to note, because it means the individual is familiar and possibly comfortable with following through on a plan. If there's any presence of psychiatric disorders, you might not be privy to this information because that's often discussed in the clinical setting. I'm not sure what student success coaches or the student development department, the information they have on individuals, but if there's known psychiatric disorders, they mentioned like mood disorders, psychotic disorders, any known substance use, antisocial behavior, aggressive impulsivity, those are things that put an individual at a higher risk of following through on a suicide plan. The key symptoms, we kind of identified some of these in the warning signs. The first one is I can never say this, anhedonia, which is just like listless and unengaged behavior. So it's kind of like depression. It's just kind of the blahs, basically. So if an individual is exhibiting the blahs, since that's way easier to pronounce, that would be something to take note of. If they're acting impulsively, often suicide attempts generally come with a thought-out plan, but sometimes the act of actually acting on the plan can be impulsive or triggered by maybe mania or some sort of kind of like mood swing. If they're exhibiting hopelessness, anxiety, panic, feeling like the world is just too much and that there's no way to navigate it without escaping it. Global insomnia. I really don't know what I typed there. I should really proofread these slides before I record them. Insomnia is another one. Just ignore that global piece. Not sleeping, you have impaired judgment often when you're not sleeping well. It's also an indicator that you might have racing thoughts, overthinking things. Sleep is very essential to mental health and well-being, and so if that's being interrupted, people might have different thoughts in those stages. Command hallucinations, that's I think more of a layman's term for that would be hearing like voices in your head telling you to do something. So that's often related to psychosis or a schizophrenic disorder. If there's a family history, there is research to show that an individual has a higher likelihood or might be more prone to completing it, just again because it is something that's familiar. It's a demonstrated pattern that is an option for escape from difficulties. Also, a family history of psychiatric disorders There's a lot of genetics involved with psychiatric disorders, and so the individual might also be prone to that as well. Again, you might not be privy to that information, but it is something if you're aware of it, will help you with the assessment. One important thing to look at when you're asking the questions is there a current stressor going on? So did something happen that led to feelings of humiliation, shame, despair, panic, feeling overwhelmed, depressed? And so often an event can kind of snowball all of those feelings they might already be feeling that might then lead to a suicide attempt. And so a breakup with a boyfriend, a fight with a family friend, failing a grade, loss of a job, loss of a friendship, increased, like we talked about, increased substance use. So using and then coming off the high, that can then trigger some of the feelings of shame as well. Access to firearms. Obviously, firearms are not allowed on campus. That does not mean that individuals do not have access to or know how to access them. If you know that an individual has direct access to firearms or the ability to get to them, that is a significant red flag that you want to take note of and take very seriously. On the flip side, there might be protective factors going on. So protective factors are basically what they sound, something that will help protect and keep someone safe. But it's important to note that even if an individual does have significant protective factors present, it does not automatically mean they're not at high risk. And so you might have the most supportive and loving family and friends, but if you have a strong desire to complete suicide, those protective factors are not going to prevent that. So protective factors you can look for can be internal and external. So internal factors are, is this individual have the ability to cope well with stress? Are there religious beliefs that would kind of counteract like any negative thoughts or thoughts of harming themselves? So like, no, if the belief is that suicide is not something that their religion values or supports, that might be kind of like, all right, I can't do it even if I want to. If the individual has good frustration tolerance. So with Kuiper being so small, hopefully a lot of times we know students fairly well and have observed them and knowing like, hey, this person can handle stress very well. Doesn't mean that they're not overwhelmed or stressed, but they might have a lot of good internal coping skills to be able to kind of get themselves safe until they can get to a safer environment. External factors, like I mentioned before, is like a support system. So family, friends. If they have children, that might not actually be very present in the situation, but maybe brothers or sisters or a family member, or even pets. So knowing that if they are not around, their pets aren't going to be taken care of, it can often be a really good way to kind of help safety plan and keep the individual future focused. Positive therapeutic relationships. Are they already engaged with a therapist? Is this something that they can just, if they can take what they've learned in therapy and get safe enough to the next day so they can talk to their therapist, that's a really good protective factor as well. And again, you don't have to necessarily go through a checklist and be like, all right, I talked about risk factors, I'm going to ask questions about protective factors, but they're benchmarks and things you just want to be mentally aware of when trying to figure out. The goal is obviously to keep the person safe at the least restrictive environment. That's very clinical talk. So trying to keep someone safe without having to put them in the hospital is an ultimate goal, because the hospital isn't a long-term solution. Engaging in outpatient therapy or in their positive supports is kind of the goal, because that's more of a long-term empowering intervention versus inpatient. So again, just things to note to try to figure out how to keep the individual safe. So the things to look for when you're asking, again, directly about the suicide, if they have an intent or if they have just ideation. So you want to look at how often, so the ideation, how often do they think about this? How intense is it? Is it fleeting? Is it every day? Do they like ruminate on this on a long time? So obviously the higher frequency of all those things, the more at risk they are. As mentioned before, if you're talking about ideation versus intent, it really comes down to, does the individual have a plan? One of my clients before called in crisis saying that she tried to kill herself. She was going to, but she wasn't successful. So automatically go into assessment mode. So I said, okay, well, what did your attempt look like? I rolled off my bed. Okay, is this like a top bunk? Is this a bottom bunk? It was a bottom bunk. So not necessarily a very high lethality of a plan. And so is that something that necessitates inpatient hospitalization? Probably not. But is it something to take note of and take seriously? Because obviously she was attempting to do something to take away the pain. Or was it, I'm feeling this way, I know this will get me the attention and the help I need. So kind of fleshing that out a little bit. I had a client come into the office with a knife, and he was holding it to his chest. This knife couldn't probably even cut through a piece of paper. It was so dull. So at face value, it looked very lethal because there's a knife and it's at his chest. But upon assessment, it was very dull. It could not have hurt him in a significant way. It couldn't even hurt me in a significant way if he tried to attack me. So at that moment, I wasn't rushing to like try to get away from him. I talked to him, and he eventually gave it to me. And I think he left it with me, which is super weird. And I threw it away because I was like, ew, I don't need a knife in my office. Anyway, so those are some of the things, like they might have a plan, but asking the questions to see if they're saying, I want to shoot myself, well, do they have the availability of the gun? Are they going to overdose on pills? Is that something that they actually have in their dorm room or have access to? Are they doing any sort of like preparation towards this? That would be like writing notes or saying goodbyes. Those are very high risk indicators. If those things haven't occurred, again, asking about them isn't necessarily going to plant the seeds in the head. It's going to give you the information that you need. So the intent, like, do they have a specific time and place where this is going to occur? Is the plan intended to be lethal, or is it intended to hurt themselves to maybe kind of get the attention and the help that they need? We like to avoid the term attention-seeking behavior only because it doesn't feel very empowering or client-focused. So it's just looking at what is the intent behind the plan or the action. Is it to actually die, or is it to get the help that they need, and they're just not sure how to articulate that? And then exploring ambivalence. So this is the time to kind of note, do they have any reasons to continue living? So is it a pet? Is it a family friend? Is it looking forward to graduation or a vacation? You really want to listen for future focused language. And so someone's talking about how they want to don't want to live, but they know that they have to get up on time for their 8 a.m. or 8:30 class. That's kind of a discrepancy right there that you can kind of jump onto because they're thinking very future focused. So that's an indicator that might have some room to kind of encourage getting to the next day. I mentioned before, past behaviors is also a indicator that they either might go through with it this time because they're becoming more and more comfortable every time. So some questions to ask during an assessment. So changes in their life and how they're coping, finding out how long it's been that they've been feeling this way, and if there's any changes that might have triggered the behavior. So those are some questions there. Staying calm is really important. Just because someone is having those thoughts does not mean that they're in immediate danger. Keeping calm is the best advice I can give in any sort of assessment. Even if you're freaking out inside, staying calm. People are going to mirror your behavior or mirror kind of how your presentation is, and that's a really good de-escalation technique if they're very escalated. And in crisis, staying calm creates an environment to kind of match the behavior, because at some point they're going to have to either bring themselves down or have an intervention based on how they're doing. Again, I am running out of time with this recording, so we're going to have a part 3, but those are the first steps. We'll do intervention and documentation and a wrap up in part 3.